Welcome to this informative video, exploring the important category, reliability of the Bible. In this two-part series, we're focusing specifically on the reliability of the Old Testament. Back in the book of Deuteronomy 31, we find a specific passage in verse 24 that says, "And it came to pass, when Moses had finished writing down the words of this law in a book, until they were completely finished." And elsewhere, for example, in the New Testament, the Lord Jesus himself says that Moses is the author of the 5 books of Moses. But is that even possible? Moses lived approximately 1500 BC. That means 3,500 years ago. And the question is, were people at that time even able to write yet? If that wasn't possible, of course, then it's also quite clear that Moses couldn't have been the author of the 5 books of Moses. To answer this important question, we want to look at various inscriptions that have been found throughout history. And the first thing you see right here is a clay tablet covered in pictograms. Specifically, it is a classic example of such a pictogram tablet. This tablet you see here is nothing more than a receipt. Someone was selling grain there and payment was made with livestock or fabric because ultimately money wasn't common back then. This tablet dates back to approximately 3100 BC. Now, one could argue that these are just pictograms. Well, pictograms aren't that outdated at all. Pictograms are still used today. Every traffic sign is a kind of pictorial script. And when you see signs for an emergency exit or similar, it's all represented in pictorial script so that everyone, even those who don't speak the local language, still knows what it's about. So on one hand, pictograms are very old, but that doesn't make them primitive. On the other hand, it's true that you can't just write everything down using pictorial script. Distinguishing whether someone is walking, hopping, running, hunting, and so on is of course not so easy to depict. But it only took 100 years until about 3000 BC, when they began to break down these pictograms into a more complex syllabic script, the so-called cuneiform. That means on this ancient clay tablet you see here, you can clearly see that the characters were carefully pressed into the soft, wet clay using tools like wedges. And depending on whether the written text was considered important or not, it was either fired in a hot kiln to preserve it or simply left to be air-dried. That means 3000 BC. That is 1500 years before Moses was born. And that is even another 800 years before Abraham was born. During this time, people had already developed the ability to write in a complex syllabic script. And in syllabic script, you can actually express everything you want to express. For example, the Chinese people still use a syllabic script to this very day. And it wasn't just the people in the Near East who independently developed such a script. It was also the ancient Egyptians, even if their script looked entirely different in appearance. That means from the time of 3000 BC, we know of highly developed writing systems. Moses could have, since he was raised at the court of the Egyptian pharaoh, easily fallen back on such a syllabic script. But he didn't have to at all. Because roughly 1300 years after that, somewhere around 1700 BC, or perhaps even a little bit earlier than that, the alphabet was invented. But why exactly did anyone even think of developing the alphabet? Well, that's because there's a huge disadvantage to syllabic script. And the significant drawback was that every language had a much larger number of syllables than letters. And so a young student, and here you can see an example of such a student practice tablet that is roughly 4,500 years old, had to painstakingly learn and memorize hundreds of different characters to ultimately be able to read and write fluently. That means you had to learn very, very many characters, and that paved the way for the alphabet being developed sometime around 1700 BC, or perhaps even a bit earlier than that, either in Egypt or on the Mediterranean coast. Specifically on the eastern Mediterranean coast, that is, where Lebanon is located, or where we now find Syria or Israel. The alphabet, that was a revolutionary invention, because suddenly you no longer needed to learn hundreds of characters anymore, but just about 23 or 25 simple letters were enough. These first alphabets that were used, however, still had one small disadvantage. They didn't write vowels, but exclusively consonants, that is, characters that are not vowels. The vowels were articulated orally, but they weren't written down. And if we look at a Hebrew scroll in the letter section, namely what the 5 books of Moses are written on, then we have such a consonantal text that consists only of consonants without any vowel and lacking any independent vocalic sounds. But one thing is quite certain, and hundreds of thousands of written finds show this, that at the time of Moses and even before, the alphabet had already been invented. So from that perspective, there's no problem at all with Moses being the writer of the 5 books of Moses. And that's why this verse, which we find in Deuteronomy 31, as we have carefully read, it is completely and undeniably true that Moses is the one who wrote these 5 books of Moses from the very beginning until their very end. The fascinating and noteworthy aspect is that this is not the only command we find in this verse, but Moses gives another very important and significant command, being directly guided by the Spirit of God. He then spoke directly to the Levites. Then Moses commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, giving them these instructions. Take this book of the law and put it in a place of honor right beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God. That means God did not only give the command to Moses back then that he should write down the 5 books of Moses, but God then made absolutely certain that Moses gave the command that this written word should also be carefully preserved and protected, that it was taken care of, and that it was securely deposited, where the sanctuary of the Israelites was located during that specific period in history. Back then, when they were traveling through the desert, the portable sanctuary, namely the Ark of the Covenant, and later, after they had finally arrived in the Promised Land, and when the temple was eventually built, these sacred scrolls were carefully kept at the temple. So God not only made absolutely sure that His word was written down, but also that His word was preserved, that it was protected, so to speak, so that it would be faithfully maintained over the generations to come. And that is why Moses can also write one chapter later in the fifth book of Moses, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 46, we find it written as follows: "Set your heart on all the words that I testify to you today, so that you may command your children to be careful to do all the words of this law. For it is not an empty word for you, but it is your very life." And that is something that I also sincerely wish for each of you from the bottom of my heart. That you not only own this book, the Holy Bible, but that you also take the time to diligently read and study this book every day. And that you read through this sacred book with prayer, and that you allow your very heart to be shaped by this book. And that you do not simply and only become readers or hearers of this word, but that you also become active doers of this word.